Hello everyone, welcome to the Equine Documentalist VideoCast. I'm Yogi Sharp, the Equine Documentalist, and today I'm joined by Wayne Turner from Progressive Equine Services. Today we're going to be talking about some of the common hoof morphologies, why we think they happen, and what we can do about it. Thank you for joining me, Wayne. Firstly, this is a good chance for us to show everyone that we are, in fact, not the same person.
Yeah, I get that a little bit.
Yeah, as I know, I think both of us have been asked if we're each other quite often. I certainly have.
Absolutely, and it's pretty obvious, even though this is not going to video, that I'm the much better looking one out of the two.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think the fact is that we're saying very similar things through our...
Absolutely, yeah, and I think the amount of people who are going down that path is starting to build as well, which is really interesting.
So would you like to quickly introduce yourself and give us a bit of background as to what you do over there in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. We started Progressive Equine Services about 5 years ago. We're probably pretty well known for our Facebook page and the fact that we have our own X-ray equipment, which we do our hoof scan assessments on for farriers and for owners. We work pretty hard on the very same things that we're going to talk about today, alignment and good foot balance. We're a big believer in technology is the future of this industry, and we've probably measured well over 1,300 horses now through our X-rays, through our photos, through our Metron software. So we've got a really good database to probably talk about this very thing with.
Yeah, excellent. And I know certainly I'm quite jealous of the setup you've got, because I wish I could do the X-rays and stuff, but obviously we've got stricter rules over here. But no, it's great. It's great to see your work, and I'm excited to talk about this subject that we're both quite passionate about.
Yeah, and I think just quickly that's something that, as a horse industry, we have to get a bit more open about that. The benefits that we've been able to make to so many horses, we need to start looking at it from an industry to allow more farrier-based podiatry type people in to do more podiatry X-rays and work with the farriers to improve the welfare and comfort of horses out there. Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we all need to be a bit more open-minded and a little bit more aggressive, to use your. So firstly, Wayne, why don't you briefly talk us through what the most common hoof distortions are you see on a daily basis?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been talking about this probably for 10 years. And as I say, we've been X-raying and photographing and measuring feet now pretty solidly for the last 5 years. And caudal, what we call caudal hoof failure, is the number one issue that we have, which includes underrun heels, distortion of the bulbs and the soft tissue behind the foot, prolapsing of the frog. And these are all things that we're seeing we've worked out about 90% of all horses. So it's very significant. And the ongo of that is that we get poor alignment, low palmar angles and plantar angles, which then goes on to overload issues and stance and posture problems. And it's just a bit of a cycle that we see time and again, that A, isn't being corrected, and B, it's challenging for the people who shoe in open heel shoes to actually correct it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think it's important to understand that we're both a referral, second opinion kind of business.
A little bit, yeah.
These horses are having performance issues, lameness issues, or have long established poor hoof morphology, and that could be why we're seeing a higher proportion. You mentioned 90%, but here you can see a collage, kind of short list of referrals to myself. Now, a large population of horses with lameness or performance issues have got these distortions that you just talked about. And that's actually been quantified by Dyson 2011. So I have to completely agree that the caudal hoof collapse, which we'll be talking about today, is a huge contributory factor to lameness. Now, Page and Hagen stated that 73% of horses with forelimb lameness had malalignment of the bones, which, as you can see from these images, is directly created by the distortions that we're going to discuss. But you mentioned that was as high as 90%, and I know from my business, I would say that is definitely a higher percentage than 73% of the ones that are referred to me. So I think the question is how can we stop them from getting to this point, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you made the point a little bit earlier that we do get a lot referred to us, and a lot of people. So my 90%, whilst I think it's it would be close to that anyway from what I see online and at horse shows and all these different things. We're sort of the last port of call when the farriers can't quite do something or can't help. We're getting a lot of those sort of horses. So maybe that's why it's quite the difference between 70% and 90%.
Yeah.
As I said, even with what I'm seeing everywhere else, I think it would be somewhere maybe in the middle around the 85%, 80%, but it's still an extremely high figure. And when you think that, most horses are shod with open heel shoes that we'll talk about a little bit earlier, and an industry has that higher degree of failure. As you know, I think we've got to start looking at other options.
Yeah, definitely. And I know obviously you take a lot of radiographs, as you said. And like you said, the effects of these external distortions are probably even clearer actually to see radiographically, aren't they? And this was discussed in depth in my video cast with Sylvia and Tuki, but you can see how the low dorsal angles and low heels create a broken bone alignment. If every one of these radiographs has a broken alignment, and every single one of them has low heels and collapsed caudal structures. So they certainly go hand in hand. And one thing I will say there is in fact I think it's worse when we look at the internal structures as opposed to the external, because we could all pull out our rasp and rasp that dorsal wall a little bit more to make it a bit more straight with the HPA, but we can't affect the palmar or plantar angle by doing that. No.
Even if you look at a couple here, you can see that a bit of rasping's gone on and just domed those walls a little bit, which sometimes makes it look better, but the x-rays don't lie. Yeah,
absolutely. And there was a study by Floyd 2010 that actually showed that with negative plantar angles, that once you've got a grade 2 or above, you have to have mechanical intervention in order to start correcting that. So just grasping the toe off or just trimming is not quite going to cut it.
No.
So now I know you particularly have been looking quite a lot at the distortion of the bulbs, haven't you? So would you like to just talk us through this slide?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a ripping horse, actually. It's a bit older horse, but it's just something that we're seeing in so many cases. We're seeing the contraction through the bulbs there. We're seeing stretching in the area of the digital cushion. We're seeing prolapsing of the frog through the heels of the shoe. And these are just really good examples of the very thing that we're seeing in such a high percentage, which, as I said, we're just seeing it time again.
Yeah, and again, you're saying this is due to obviously what we're seeing here. So would you?
Well, we can only look and evaluate what we're seeing, and we're seeing 90% of these horses are having these issues, and they're shod in open heel shoes, which I think we really have to start recognizing that that's part of the problem. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree, and I like to explain it with this little diagram that I created, because now one of the jobs of the frog is to act as a counteraction to the descending body weight, which we see in red. But if you look at this with the yellow lines, you can see the distance that frog has to travel before the ground reaction force can work through it, so counteract the weight of the horse. So meanwhile, all the force is concentrated on the heels, while the frog and the bulbs migrate through the gap, which we just saw in your image there. So here we see that 1, the heels get crushed, and 2, the soft caudal structures of the hoof prolapse through the middle of that gap. And this is a great and very common representation of exactly that diagram. And I think this is, you know, if you took the shoes off of that diagram you showed us just now, you'd see this, wouldn't you?
Very similar, absolutely. We see this quite regularly.
Yeah,
that's an extreme amount, but we see it to different. You know, it's in pretty much every horse that we're looking at. We're seeing that to a medium to heavy degree. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the reason I put this one up, because it kind of shows the extreme of it. And if you look, heels have actually collapsed to round the thickness of the shoe. So the caudal structures, namely the frog and the bulbs, have prolapsed through that yellow gap that we showed in the last diagram. And like you just agreed, I think this is what we're seeing to varying degrees in the majority of our referrals, isn't it?
And if you look at the hairline in that, you see that distinct V that we see, you know, above your red line in just about every horse that's been shod consistently for 2 years or more.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously the frog and the digital cushion and these caudal structures that we're talking about, they're part of the hemodynamic system. And, they manipulate the blood flow within the hoof to dampen the forces of impact. So here's a picture of 2 of the traditional theories of hemodynamic mechanism. In both of the theories, the ground reaction force acting through the frog and onto the digital cushion plays a vital role in the hydraulics of the system and reducing the shock going through the heels and through the whole foot. So if we stop this system from working efficiently by lifting the frog off the floor, it has a knock-on effect on the structures of the hoof. And now Bowker suggested a different theory for hemodynamics after a study that found negative pressure in the digital cushion. He suggested that the bars of the foot and the pillars of the hoof will push the lateral cartilages up and outward, drawing blood up from the sole. But even with this theory, there is still emphasis on the structures working efficiently and as a unit.
And I think too that makes a really good point, because I often get asked, you know, what do I just put a bar shoe on it? And the answer is no. Like a bar shoe, to me, the standard straight bar shoe, to me, we need a lot more thickness or width in there, because you've got, you know, your bars, your frog, all of that area needs to be utilised. So it's not just having a bar across the back.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll see a little bit later we use frog plates and different types of shoes to stimulate that area and offload weight across just the heels alone.
Yeah, and even if you're using just a heart bar, there's still 2/3 of that back half of the foot that aren't being...
Absolutely.
So, and obviously, as well as the actual prolapse of the structures through the gap that we were referring to, the increased shock to the heels is also exacerbating the issue, because the hemodynamic system's not working. Actually, that's been quantified. Williman et al. 1997, Rupp-Sturff 1999, and Parks and Witt 2015 all found that there was higher landing velocities, higher peak forces, and higher and longer impact vibrations in the traditionally shod feet. So, as well as those structures prolapsing through the middle of that gap, you've also got these increased shock on the heels, which is crushing them as well, isn't it? Because we're not using the
absolutely. And as everything sort of starts to collapse and fail, as you said, we then get increases of what we should have beyond the level that it can, physiologically can handle. So it gets progressively worse as the hoof capsule fails more and becomes more distorted.
Yeah, exactly. And because the like, if you look at the heels, they start to collapse, and then when they're collapsed and they bear weight, then they collapse even more, and then that's where you create the vicious cycles. I
talk a little bit to my clients when trying to explain it. It's like a straw. If you push a straw directly point to point, there's
Yeah.
a little bit of resistance. But if you turn it side and push it in the middle, there's no resistance at all. And once those horn tubules start to run forward,
Yeah.
they're not being loaded point to point, they're more being loaded from the side, and everything just starts to run under and collapse even more. Yeah.
Now, as you mentioned, we see this collapse in varying degrees, and I think a lot of how much distortion you get will depend somewhat on the individual elastic modulus of the hoof. So you've got two differently conformed caudal structures. So like on the left, you've got a strong hemodynamic system. So you've got cartilages that are nice and thick. They extend all the way across the foot. They contain the blood vessels, and also the digital cushions actually contains fibrocartilage. So that's a relatively strong system. So that's going to put up with this perimeter open-heeled toe, open-heeled shoe, more so than the weaker system on the other side, which has got thinner cartilages. They don't connect across the back, so the digital cushion doesn't contain fibrocartilage. So the reality is, yes, conformation does play a role in this discussion. But actually, instead of saying that's just as conformation, we should be emphasising, I think, even more so that these weaker feet need certain structures to be functioning optimally.
Absolutely.
And be proactive.
And it could even come down to, which the Barefoot have talked about for a long time, about how we work our young horses to try and develop that stronger system prior to going into shoes.
Yeah.
I know you and I both believe that open heel shoes aren't in the benefit of the horse whatsoever, so we need to maybe look at that. But it certainly throws weight behind what's been said for a little while about how we strengthen that system up in our younger horses prior to putting them into shoes. I think that's something that's a real
absolutely. And then obviously that's really emphasised in the racing horse, isn't it? And I know
absolutely, yeah.
Both Bowker and Post have suggested that the developmental stages of the hemodynamic system in the young horse is important in the system you end up with an adult, as you just stated. The mental stage is really important. And basically it comes down to use it or lose it, doesn't it, to a certain extent?
Yeah.
If we don't stimulate those hemodynamic systems, or if we put a shoe on from an early age that negates its function, then it atrophies. And I think to a certain extent, this is also what we're seeing in these distortions of caudal hoof, isn't it? Because they're just not having the stimulation that they need. Yeah,
definitely. And it's funny because you read a lot about the racing game that try and build bone and try and build muscle and try and build all these areas to improve the horse and make it go faster. But there's very little that seems to be done with preparing the foot for racing. Yeah,
and it could even be something as simple as, I know I discussed with Derek Popard about training racehorses barefoot. That was in a VideoCast. But also it could be something as simple as, if they have to be shod from 18 months, then provide them with the frog support and support of the caudal structures, which we're obviously going to talk about a little bit more in a minute.
Absolutely, and even softening the materials that they're landing on. For weak feet, they're landing on steel and even on a softer surface where that heel may enter into the surface a little bit more, where you've got a much broader package on their shoes, which halts everything a little bit faster. We obviously know that forces, they come to an even force for the foot to land and maintain, but the faster that happens, the more I could imagine it's going to impact on that foot.
Yeah. Now, obviously, we're talking about young horses, and these distortions do happen over time, don't they? And this is possibly what makes it hard for people to spot until it's further down the road. You've got some great images here to help express that. So
these were sent to me from somebody who follows my Facebook page, and you're looking at I think it was a 3 or 4-year-old horse, I think, on the left, first set of shoes, and 5 years later you can see exactly what we're talking about. all the back of the foot has just collapsed. The capsule's got longer through the quarters, so you can imagine that from the side there'd be quite a bit of coronary band distortion, but it's a really good example of what we've talked about.
Yeah.
So this is just another. So this was actually one of my horses. That's on the left, the 6-year-old horse. It had only been shot. It was a big warm blood, beautiful horse. You can see that V starting to shape. That horse has been shot for 2 years. As opposed to the other foot, which has never been shod. That's a 10-year-old horse that's been barefoot all its life. And you can see the difference in the coronary band, the angle of the hairline in the back of the foot already. And this is the same 6-year-old horse. I only shod this horse. This is my shoeing. I'd only shot it a couple of times. But you can see that coronary band dipping down quite strongly at the back and the horn tubule starting to run under. So this is a big 17-hand warm blood. And as I said, 6-year-old, you can imagine where these are going to go if something's not actually done about it in the pretty soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you're obviously mentioning the hairline pathway is what I call it, the coronary band distortion. And that's something that I'm using more and more actually to kind of assess this, to assess how much caudal collapse we have.
Yeah.
Look at this hoof. In all honesty, it looks pretty nice. It's got reasonably straight hoof pastanaxis, reasonable proportions. But if we look closer at the heel to toe angles, they're beginning to reach 5-degree difference. And the coronary band is starting to curl downwards at the heels, as you had in the previous picture. So this foot is starting to prolapse. And like you said with the one just before, if we don't start to address this now, then it's only going downhill. Now we might be lucky enough to have a foot that's strong enough to cope with it and float around this kind of distortion. But we have to ask whether it's only a matter of time before things get worse, don't we? If we don't intervene.
Absolutely. And I think now is probably a good time to talk about that very thing that you just mentioned is what we tend to see with farriers around the world is a reluctance to start changing things at this point.
Yeah.
So it generally they wait until it's either impacting on the horse's comfort or soundness, or the horse's performance before anything gets changed. And that heel angle and that caudal failures goes on and on and on until it gets to a point where the horse can no longer deal with it.
Yeah.
And then we generally, as farriers, start to go, okay, we better do something. Instead of saying, well, it's 10 or 12 degrees lower than the dorsal wall, we need to start doing it now to prevent that soundness and performance issue. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dyson 2011 actually mentioned that greater than 5-degree difference is sign of caudal prolapse, and you can see that in the hairline as well. And he also found that a greater proportion of non-lame horses had a straight coronet band compared with lame, which had, of course, the opposite, being a curved coronet band. So study found that the curved coronet band, or the caudal prolapse, which we're talking about, is directly linked to lameness. So again, coming back to Dyson 2011, found that the height difference between the coronary band at the toe and the heel also correlated with the severity of lameness. So the greater this difference was, the more lame the horse was. And if we look at the prolapsing of the coronet band, it's prolapse of the caudal structure. So as this hairline starts curving downwards, it's showing us that those caudal structures are prolapsing back. And when we add frog support padding to this, we very often see an immediate improvement in this ratio, or I certainly do anyway.
Yep, absolutely.
And we see that, often we see that bulb immediately kind of puff up. Something else that Dyson 2011 study found was a large proportion of feet with non-parallel horn tubules and non-parallel growth rings were also linked to the severity of lameness. So if you can see here, the horn tubals at the heel and the horn tubals at the toe are at completely different angles, and that obviously correlates with the amount of prolapse. Is that something that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. We see that. Again, that's the 90%. That you know, anything where the heel starts to underrun, we're not getting parallel dorsal wall, horn and heel. And that's where I think we talked about the straw a bit earlier. You know, when we have good, strong horn tubules, front and back, we tend to have pretty good, strong feet. But as they change their angles, the forces are now hitting that horn tubule in a different direction, and they just get more and more underrun. Yes. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Now, interestingly, now we start getting into why this is happening. So, Dyson's study cited an earlier study by Snow and Birdsall from 1990, which suggested that a change in the shape of the hoof may be the result of a shoe restricting normal capsular deformation, which we can see in this image. So this is normal capsular deformation. This deformation accommodates shear forces generated within the hoof. And again, this image shows us the normal deformation that hoof goes through. So it is meant to deform, but then it returns to shape. The hoof capsule is viscoelastic in that sense, which means that within its elastic capacity, it will return to form after being deformed. But if we go back to that, we can see that that's obviously not return to form. So these studies are suggesting, I think, that shoeing or traditional shoeing restricts this viscoelasticity, leading to the permanent deformation instead of elastic deformation.
Yeah.
This also correlates with Malone and Davies, which found contracted coronet bands in shod horses versus bare feet, which I also thought was very interesting. Now, this would also correlate with the Rupsturf 2001 study. This study found that the shod foot had reduced expansion and contraction, but support padding returned this expansion and contraction closer to the bare foot. So this could be hypothesized to be because of more efficient use of the hemodynamic structures, which we talked about earlier. And this would logically help to reduce contraction and prolapse. You know, if the back of the hoof is functioning better, it's going to be less likely to contract and prolapse.
Yeah.
So we can extrapolate that the reduced functionality and engagement of the caudal structures by traditional shoeing leads to their distortion, and also the prolapse is simple result of gravity.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's more than fair, and I think you know, without going too far back, I think if we look at how horseshoes, or when they were first developed, you know, they weren't developed with a scientific approach. They were developed to prevent wear and tear to the horse's feet. You know, that's no matter what we say, to this day, as far as I'm aware, there's no science behind a horseshoe, especially an open heel metal shoe, having any benefit to the horse's physiology whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to shoeing, we have to, whether we like it or not, we have to look at the barefoot hoof and how it functions.
Absolutely, yeah.
As part of what we're trying to achieve. You know, as I said, this is not a barefoot versus shoeing, because I think there's great things on both sides, but I think we have to look at the function of the foot and the physiology of the entire horse and say, how can we do that more suitably to the horse and the foot in front of us?
Yeah.
And I don't think that we've achieved that with the conventional shoe.
No. Absolutely, especially when we've now got these studies kind of showing us that, you know, traditional shoeing is having an effect on the biomechanics of the foot, you know, and you know, when we've actually got that quantified now, we need to, I think, have a mindset change towards how we shoe these horses.
And I think people, sorry, just quickly, I think people have to understand, because I know I get a lot of hate mail. We're so positive about the industry as a whole, and farriers and shoeing and all that sort of thing, we're not anti anybody. We just see a massive failure in front of us, and we may look at it a little bit more objectively than some, and we just feel that we need to, if we're going to progress as an industry, we need to adopt some different protocols in our trimming and our shoeing and what our ideal is with how we're going to shoe the foot in front of us. That's what I feel.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. I think we need to go back to looking at the barefoot, and because we're never going to beat thousands of years of evolution, are we? So we should be going back to look at how it functions and how we can most closely mimic it, I think. So now you've got a case study here. There's a few slides here to show some changes that can be achieved when we address these issues.
So this is a case study that we did of a really, really talented and well-bred show jumper. It's related to a world champion. They paid a lot of money for this horse. And this is the left hind foot. The horse couldn't get around 90 centimetres clear, and it was, it was balking at jumps. It was running off everywhere after jumps. It was just not comfortable. And it was shod by a really, really good, well-qualified farrier. And a friend of hers, the owner, said to get us to have a look at the feet, and we did. And the horse was negative about 2 or 3 degrees, I think, in both hind feet, and negative in one front. So we corrected that by slightly altering the trim. There wasn't a huge amount of sole depth there. We put a duo elliptical shoe on. We supported the caudal foot, elevated, tried to get better alignment, and you can see the result in a bit over 12 months. And that foot, even though that's barefoot, we still shoe the horse. But that foot, that horse, is now jumping at 1.50 metres, 1.60 and it's had a couple of wins and it's placing regularly. So one is just how important alignment is to the horse.
Yeah.
But also how important caudal support is from a shoeing package on correcting the back of the foot, or that failure in the foot. And I suppose that's what's drilled it into me so much about the open heel shoe, is that when we use caudal support, we can actually correct and change and if done correctly, prevent the caudal failure from happening in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is not something that we only see, and why I talk about the farrier, the quality of the farrier, is it's not something that we only see in poor farriery. We see this with the best farriers in the world still having this same problem. So to me, that's a really important part of the puzzle, to recognise that it's not just out of poor farriers. So this we've been able to correct, and it's a really upright horse. So you can see the pastern angles are quite upright. And I actually had my doubts initially that we would be able to achieve alignment, but I think we're getting, we're not there yet, but we'll get fairly close in the next few months, I think.
Well, what I find quite interesting with cases like this is, if you look at the pastern on the left, is actually more upright than on the right. And very often, I think these horses are actually trying to lift themselves out of their uncomfortable heels.
Yeah, absolutely.
And often,
and just quickly on that, I think that cannon bone, just by the look of that, is a little bit more forward. So, but you're correct.
Yeah.
But it is, we find putting these horses on blocks to do X-rays and photos is quite uncomfortable for them. So it is really difficult to get an ideal hind end, because obviously we don't sedate. Being a farrier, we can't sedate the horses.
Yeah, yeah.
So it is quite difficult when they're negative behind to get them standing on blocks perfectly how we want them. So I do think it's slightly forward, but I totally agree. I think that horses in both front and hinds do tend to stand with a more upright pastern axe.
Now, these you've got different measurements that you take from this same case that you've got to explain to us here.
Yeah, so this is a Metron system that we use for, it's a hoof measuring software, which we utilise every single day of the year pretty much. and it allows us to have some really good objective data. You know, the horse industry in general is full of subjective opinion. We don't like to use that, whether it's our X-rays and photos with our Metron or our Biomex gait analysis systems and those sort of things. We really like our objective data, and this just gives you an idea of where we've gone from. So it had a hoof angle of 49 degrees when we started, and a heel angle of 27 degrees. So there's 22-degree difference there. We've now got 54 degrees in the hoof angle and 41.5 degrees in the heel angle. So we've been able to create a 14-degree change in heel angle. And as you can see, the hoof looks much more aligned, and the horses, enjoying that a lot more as well.
Yeah. And obviously that heel angle has then a direct effect on the toe to heel height ratio, doesn't it? Which is...
Absolutely. And this is one that I think a lot of people miss, is that the capsular height, it makes a big difference. When we're getting a lot of ground reaction forces into the feet, we get lower coffin bones, less sole depth. I think the capsular height is a really important factor.
Yeah, and obviously going back to the Dyson 2011 study, they mention in there that ideally you should be having a 3-to-1 ratio between that heel height and the type.
Yeah.
And then you've got this measurement here. Maybe just talk us through this measurement.
Yeah, this slide just talks about the amount of toe forward of the front of the coronary band, and I get told often that people think we have a long toe issue in farriery, and personally I don't see that. I see a bad alignment issue in farriery, and this is a really good example. Is that the toe, or the amount of foot forward of the coronary band in this foot, in the first one with the green backing, is nearly a centimetre or 6-7 mils, whatever it is, longer than what it is in the right one. But if you looked at the HL zone and sole, there's virtually no difference. So to me, I wouldn't class it as a long toe. But as we lose alignment, everything grows more forward and in a different direction. And I think that's where we have our issues with people looking at feet and saying it's long-toed.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And also, of course, it's basic trigonometry. If you've got the same length at a more acute angle, it's going to have a longer base length.
Exactly, yeah.
So, it comes
and I think Renat Weller's studies on, excuse me if I'm wrong with those, but I think it was for every 1 centimetre of length on the toe, it created about 50 kilos of load on the deep flexor. Yeah. And there was another one as well that talked about palmar angle for every, I think they termed it sole angle, but for every 1 degree less, it increased the load on the back of the foot by about 4%. So, these factors, every aspect of this changes load, changes posture, changes, performance, comfort, and has a massive effect on the entire horse. So yes, really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then obviously we can see a change in obviously the hairline and the bulbs as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one. And talking to some really top farriers about this, and they were very unaware that this even happened. And it's quite interesting when I look back at the amount of feet that we've corrected, and we see that stretching of the area behind the pastern there. It gets much flatter, much longer, and you can see as it corrects, we get much more bulbous or rounded look, and quite a bit shorter. Now, I'm not sure the impact of that or what that's actually telling us, but it's certainly something that we're noting on the correction of these.
I often see that actually happen as soon as you give them frog contact, and I think it's probably a lot to do with the digital cushion being
absolutely
plumped up, if you like. So now, obviously, this case here, you use Duro Ellipse, you mentioned, which is this on the left, isn't it?
Yeah. So, but when I put those shoes on, I'm just about to explain to the owner that it's really important that you give the horse time to build up to these shoes and blah, blah, blah. The spiel about 6 degrees or probably more, maybe 6 degrees, I think, 5 or 6 anyway with the trim. And they said, I'm really sorry, we're putting this horse on a truck to go to a massive competition in Queensland, which is 1,000 k's away. And I was a bit distraught, and I'm thinking, this is not what we want. We can't do this to this really good horse. Anyway, the horse was put on the truck, and they went up there, and the horse jumped the lights out, and nobody could believe that it was the same horse. They just said that, what have you done? And to their credit, they could have jumped it a lot more, but they didn't because of they wanted to look after the horse. But everybody knows this horse because he's got so much talent, but it just could never get over through the jumps or never get through clear. So that was really interesting and we obviously don't condone that or don't advocate for that, but it just showed that once we gave that horse alignment, it could do its job. I think we did about 3 or 4 cycles in the dual elliptical shoe, and then we went into frog plates, which is the other photo there. And this is a little bit about what we were talking earlier about, is that it's not about having a bar shoe on, it's about supporting the frog and the bars and more that area, just forward of and to the heels more than at or behind the heels.
Yeah, and also I think it's not just about support, as you said. I think also a lot of it comes down to actual stimulation as well.
Yeah.
Now, Taylor 2020 discussed the hoof as a smart structure and explained how smart structures respond to the loads and stresses that are placed upon them. This study also touched again on the importance of the developmental stage and the youngsters getting that stimulation from early on. So what it's saying, the caudal hoof, as we're discussing, is direct reflection of its relationship with the environment. That's what the study was saying, Taylor 2020. The study highlighted how we are so used to seeing these distorted frogs and digital cushions that this has all become a norm, hasn't it? All these distortions we're seeing. It also outlines some of the ideals. So we can see in the matte hoof on the top left that the frog's width should be 50 to 60% of its length. Now, a lot of these feet we're seeing with these distorted hoof, these caudal distortions, have got really contracted frogs, and they're much longer than they are wide. And these distortions will correlate with how the frog appears on the sole view as well. So we're talking about how we're seeing these caudal structures prolapse through the middle of that yellow gap, as we talked about earlier. Very often see that same, or we'll see the distortion in how the frog actually appears as well. The frog should have a shallow, wide central sulcus. So many hooves have deep, thrushy sulci, like the picture on the right. Much of the time, this is due to management, but also, I think, again, coming back to stimulation, plays a huge role in the frog's health.
Yeah.
So we are talking about supporting that frog. I think we've got to really understand that actually, going back to the statement, use it or lose it, is that the frog actually needs stimulation.
Which is why we use that dental impression material and that as well. So not only to spread load, but we're also getting a more functional application into that foot as well. Yeah,
exactly. And you see barefoot, when the horses go barefoot, they almost always create a positive morphology. Now, to ask why that is, and going back to the statement we made earlier, we have to look back to the barefoot and try and understand why it perhaps does better than the shod foot. There are, of course, different reasons, but if we look at the proportions of the caudal structures in the right-hand side, they've been stimulated differently, because this is a hoof that's come out of shoes, and this is the barefoot morphology. So that the frog and the caudal structures are being stimulated differently, and they're therefore adapting to the new loads, as Taylor 2020 suggests. And actually the whole hoof is changing shape as a result. And I see many feet do exactly the same as this when we give them that frog support and stimulation. Taylor 2020 also outlines some of the ideals for the back of the foot, which we're talking about, the caudal structures. The back of the foot should be split into thirds with 2 lateral cartilages and the centre filled with the digital cushion, which should be around 2 inches thick and 3 to 4 fingers wide. And it should be quite dense, like a tennis ball, and hard to deform and feel the lateral cartilages. Now, I certainly know in most of my shod feet that are coming to me for referral, there's no way to be able to say that the lateral cartilages were a third each and the digital cushion was a third. I don't know if you'd say the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking about the hoof function, which obviously is more optimal in the barefoot. So that's where we're talking about ways of trying to replicate that barefoot, aren't we? So you've got some
absolutely. And I think also the fact that we're trying to spread the load across more of that foot instead of just having it taken on the heels and the wall, which I think is a really big factor as well. You mentioned it a little bit earlier how it's been shown that the heels crush under load. They just take too much load. Yep. So I think there's numerous benefits to this type of shoeing and even different products. We trialed urethane shoes for a little while and got great results with them. But they've got their drawbacks. Don't get me wrong. We're not advocating specifically for them. And I think that's where we are as an industry. We have to not forget tradition, but we need to start looking at the results we're achieving or not achieving and start moving in a direction that, as we said earlier, is along some of the lines of a package that's going to be much more suited to the hoof when it comes to function, morphology, and physiology.
Absolutely. And then this is a hoof you want.
Perfect example, isn't it? So this is a horse that the foot was just any time you put a metal shoe on, it just collapsed. It had really low heels. You can see on the left, 24 degrees. It was long in the foot because of the angle that it was going. And I'd heard a little bit about flip-flops and the fact that we've been trialing or about to trial a new idea of shoe along this line a little bit, but quite a bit different. And I said to them, let's try this. So they said, yep, let's do it. So you can see the foot on the left, that was day one of the first shoeing, and the foot on the right is 9 weeks later. So that was 2 cycles, one about 4.5 weeks and the other about 5. And you can see with the benefit of a softer material behind, caudal support, and also on-off loading, the flip-flop doesn't hold against the foot, so it comes away from the foot, loads it, comes away from the foot, loads it. And you can see an unbelievable difference in that foot in only 9 weeks. And I think we now have to start, I'm not saying flip-flops are the solution to the world, but I think we have to start looking at the results that we get with products like this and start introducing them into more mainstream farriery, because there's no way in hell you could get that anywhere near that improvement in open heel metal shoe, because this foot is a really, really weak foot.
Yeah, I agree. And I think at the end of the day, what flip-flop may not be the be-all and end-all, but what we're trying to do here, what you're trying to do here is, again, coming back to replicating the bare foot, because that back section is meant to be flexible, is meant to move, and the front end is more of a wear, part of the foot. So again, it comes to trying to go back to nature, while still providing the protection that we may need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's really important to acknowledge, is that with farriery, we can change that front of the foot with a rasp, but we can't do it with the back of the foot. So we probably cheated the foot a little bit for a lot of years. but the back of the foot's the one that tells us the truth, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually a lot of the time when people are trying to create better angles by taking it off the toe, actually they're weakening the whole structure. When the toe,
I think that's a fair call. Yeah.
Where actually the toe, like as you said before, the toe is not actually long, because when you look at the radiographically, that toe is following the dorsal wall of the pedal bone.
Yeah.
Toe's not. The toe's
zones are ideal. Yep, absolutely. Not an excessive amount of sole, but just going in the wrong direction, which makes it look long. Yes, absolutely.
So it's the back end and it's the ratio between the heel and the toe that actually needs addressing.
Yeah, yeah. And that's not easy to do.
Of course, the skill of the farrier, environment and shoeing cycles play obviously a huge role in this as well.
And nutrition, nutrition, work, every aspect, absolutely.
Yeah. And also the micro conformation of the hoof, going back to what we were talking about before, the difference between that weak foot and that strong foot.
Sorry, can you just flick back just quickly, because I meant to pick up something on that last. So this is a really good example of what you were about to say, because you and I both feel quite strongly that we should shoot a 50-50 around the centre of rotation to get the best results. From getting that toe back to where it's not ideal where it is. And we got a bit of flack about that, about not setting the shoe back further, but we wanted to trial this flip-flop ideal on a really bad foot without making, excessive change. It proved to me that even with a slightly longer lever forward, that we were still able to make those changes, which says to me that just the importance of that caudal support and even the softer material and the on-off loading, I think is really important to the foot. So sorry to jump in there, but that's I think a bit of a factor that we have to look at, because a lot of people say, no, it's a long toe or it's whatever, but I feel that that's more so when we've got open heel shoes and the back of that foot collapsing, it just makes everything look a lot worse. Whereas when we support the back of that foot, have a softer material there, even with a slightly longer lever, we can still get such good results.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you went a little bit robotic at the beginning of that, but what you're talking about, shoeing around the centre of rotation, I think is obviously a huge factor. And we can't deny that the micro conformation of the particular horse plays a role in both how much the foot will fail and how much that foot will be able to positively morph after failure. But having said that, the point of the discussion is that if we shoe horses with frog support as a default, will we go some way to mitigating that prolapse in the first place? Now, take this foot. So it's an ex-racing thoroughbred, probably the hardest type of foot to kind of re-establish, which similar to the foot you just showed us. It responded beautifully to shoeing around the centre of rotation, frog support, an appropriate shoeing cycle, and something that I agree, I think is very important, actually leaving the integrity of the toe and the structure
of the capsule,
that aren't actually wrong, because the toe wasn't actually wrong, it's just at a very acute angle. So if we start taking all that toe off, we actually make a weaker structure that collapses even more. So you can back it up, but in my opinion, rasping the dorsal wall more upright actually leads to further collapse as you reach the integrity of the whole structure. So again, coming back to the fact that what we need to be doing is focusing on creating a better caudal half of the foot, and not keep blaming it on long toes, like say. And if you look at dimensions here in this foot, between on the bottom you've got the coronet line, you've got the heel angle, you've got the dorsal wall angle, and then you've got the hoof pastern axis. And the caudal hoof being in the right place affects all of these different parameters.
Yeah.
I
think quickly you were just mentioning the coronary band, and I think something really important, if you can just flick back to that one of mine that we were just talking about, often is that when we're more distorted, you can see more bend to the coronary band in the corrected foot than what we have in the initial one. And I see that all the time. So as much as we would like to keep everything in line and correct at all times, I think when we're correcting feet, the hoof capsule corrects it in different parts, distortion in that coronary band before we get it more correct towards the end. So, if people are correcting these feet and they're starting to, somebody mentions that there's more bend in that coronary band or distortion, don't get discouraged, because that will catch up in the long run. But it often gets more distorted before it gets better.
Yeah, but having said that, if you look at the coronet band, it's definitely straighter on the or at a shallower angle than it is on the left.
Yeah, exactly. But there's probably, if you're looking at front to right at the back, you're probably looking at a bit more bend in it, so a little bit more distortion. But as that heel continues to improve, it's going to catch up with the quarter, and that'll become more straight as we go along.
Yeah. So going back to this foot. So again, this is a thoroughbred foot, and these have genetic tendencies towards having weak feet and poorly developed hemodynamic structures because of what we said earlier about them not being allowed to be developed. But what we did here and what we're talking about is we're creating both support and, if you like, we're creating like an external hemodynamic system. And these feet are actually the ones that need it most. These collapsed feet are the ones that need us to give them an external hemodynamic system, an external frog, an external digital cushion, because their own ones have become so weak and prolapsed. So we're actually kind of giving the foot what it's lacking.
We get it quite a lot with people saying that you can't put all these horses in because you've got weaker footed horses and you've got horse husbandry issues and breeding issues, but as you say, they're the type of horses that need this type of shoeing more than the stronger footed Arabs and those types, because these horses suffer a lot more with those very same distortions, which is what you're showing up in that top right corner. Look at that heel angle and the whole capsule. So absolutely.
Yeah. Exactly. Now
So this is a really good one. This is the 2 feet that we talked about with the show jumper. And this is a really good example, because if you have a look at the photo on the left, you can see that there's no excessive length of toe. There's no distortion on that foot. It's just going at a different angle. And when you look at the center of rotation or thereabouts, the distance forward of the center of rotation, because of that poor low palmar angle and alignment, you can see how it's about a centimetre further than that center of rotation, as opposed to the one on the right hand side. So that's a really good example of how we create longer levers forward of COR with poor alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going back to obviously that foot there, wasn't it?
That's that foot, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it just comes back to talking again. There's the X-rays on top of the overlaid over the photos. I think it just comes back to again that when we talk about caudal failure of the foot, it's not just caudal failure of the foot. There's an issue with foot function. There's an issue with length. There's an issue with load. It's caudal hoof failure is the cause of so many issues right through the entire horse. I think you did one a little while ago talking about the connection of the feet and the horse, which was fantastic. And And I think that's what we have to recognise, is it's not just that heel hasn't just collapsed and the caudal foot's collapsed. It's all of those other areas that create issues because of that we have to understand better.
Yeah, absolutely. It affects, you know, the entire horse at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you know, coming back to this long toe versus low heel thing, I think, you know, this is another good example of that. And I think it's really important to understand that to have that the hoof proportions are about the toe to heel height ratios. So very often, again, people refer to, like on the top, they'd refer to it having a long toe. And this is something that I want to drum home here in this, is that actually it just has low heels, and most of the time, again, this is because of the caudal hoof distortions, and you can clearly see that even in the X-ray. So when we improve the toe to heel ratio by working backward from that point, i.e. improve the morphology of the caudal structures, the toe becomes less acute and actually no longer looks so long. Now, if you look at the caudal structures in these, you can see how graduated frog support pads were added. You can actually see how the bulbs of the heel have plumped up. Also, we can see how in the first radiograph, the distortions we've spoken about affect all of the parameters of the hoof balance. So you've got a long toe lever arm, which you showed us in that X-ray, which is actually shortened just by creating a better heel to toe ratio. So these distortions that we're talking about, in my opinion, are the biggest part for creating the poor hoof conformations that we see. So I think we have to ask as well, are these man-made, and is there a better way? Because, you know, if you took that foot in the top out of shoes and it went barefoot, it would create better proportions of its own. So, you know, there's a lot of question about whether we should provide elevation, but you know, if that hoof is where it is because of the lack of healthy caudal structures, then we have to address that toe to heel height ratio, don't we?
Yeah, and I think one of the really important things that we have to consider, especially with the hind feet when we get low and negative angles, is how how posture and stance is affected. Because, you know, without going into that too much, because we'll get a bit off track, but when you have low to negative alignment or PA in your hind feet, the horse stands more forward, more under its belly, and those heels get crushed.
Yeah.
And we often see barefoot horses that never, that don't improve radiographically year in, year out, week in, like month in, month out, because we go back to barefoot, or we have barefoot trimmers come in and get their horses hoof scanned, and they're a little bit shocked that, yep, we seem to be able to get front feet changes quite easily barefoot, but not the hinds. And I think it comes back to stance and posture from the negative and the low alignment that keeps crushing those heels behind. So my personal opinion is that when we're correcting hind feet, it's really important to add some correction there with alignment.
Yeah, definitely. I think because I've spoken a lot in the video cast with Martina that I did.
Yeah, that was a good one too. That was great.
Linking the hind hoof with higher pathology and talking about the posture that's associated with the two. And that posture does perpetuate the cycle. But
I think so. Yeah.
What I've found, and I think you found the same thing, is that once you actually create these better proportions of the foot, that does have a direct effect on the posture. But having said that, very often this posture is caused by other issues that have also got to be addressed. So we have to remember that, you know, the hoof is a product of its environment and the loads that are placed upon it. So often, you know, we need to be addressing other areas of the horse as well to create better hoof morphology.
Absolutely. You know, body workers, chiro, all of that sort of things are physios. You know, we work with them all the time. We have our own groups that we work with. We advocate that as much as we can, because it's everybody plays their part, and that's something that we're trying to promote more and more in Australia by working together for the benefit of the horse, as opposed to everybody doing their own thing. I think it's really important to have a good team around any horse. Yep.
Definitely. Now, going back to perpetual cycles, we'll talk about a few studies here that talk about the heel and toe ratios and how that perpetuates. Firstly, the dorsal wall angle. So there's a few studies into the dorsal wall angle. Thompson et al. 1992 and 2002 found that the inclination of the dorsal wall was influence the surface strain values in the hoof wall. And also it's thought to influence the stress strain levels and distribution within the hoof capsule. And the angle of the toe was thought to directly affect the internal tissue strain levels in the hoof and the distal limb, and the angulation of the joints within the phalangeal axis. That was Balk et al. 1991 and Thompson et al. 2001. Basically, there's a deterioration in structural coherence of the foot in a low hoof angle compared to a high angle. So that's where we get these perpetual cycles, where the actual proportions of the foot create negative forces on the foot. And then that's where we get this perpetual cycles.
Yep.
And it's the same with the heel angle. So the studies into the heel angle, again, we've got this Dyson 2011. The heel angle is thought to be important in providing adequate palmar support to the foot. Of course, that goes without saying, really. But also it directly affects the influence, directly influences the tissue strains in the palmar aspect of the foot. Turner 1986, Turner 2004. And also a low heel angle positively associated with musculoskeletal injury, Kane et al. 1998. So these horses are not only got hoof issues, but they're predisposed to, again, what we're talking about, musculoskeletal injury around the whole body.
Yeah.
And also
postural adaptations and changes in joints. I think you did a fantastic one with Sylvia and Dr. Myers on alignment, and that was great to listen to those two talk about it, and I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and also, of course, going back to that Kane et al. Study, when these horses are working at fast speeds, if that foot is collapsed the way it is, then they are going to be predisposed to catastrophic injury.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what's really important, those studies were, some of the studies were on the toe angle, some of the studies were on the heel angle, but what's really important is these angles compared to each other. So I just want to reiterate some of that. So this ratio provides a measure of degree of collapse. So an angular difference of greater than 5 degrees is historically claimed to be indicative of underrun collapsed heel. So that goes back to that Snow and Birdsall study in 1990. Underrun heels are the most common hoof imbalance, which obviously you were saying 90% of the horses that are referred to you. This particular study said it was occurring in 52% of non-lame athletic horses. So even horses that aren't lame, the study showed 52% of them had already had these caudal. And this imbalance occurs 1.5 times more often in the lame horse, which Turner 2004. So, it's a major issue, isn't it? And it's
absolutely, because 1.5 that takes it back up to that 75% range.
Yeah.
And I think anything that has a failure rate of 50 to 75% has to reassess its its values and its protocols, because unfortunately the horses are doing it tough out there, and I think we can do better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it comes back to, you know, it was said 52% of non-lame horses already had this discrepancy in heel-to-toe ratio. And I think it comes back to us dealing with that at an earlier stage. And I know you've got a case here, actually, to talk about that with.
Yeah, so this is a thoroughbred foot that we're in the process of rehabbing. It just went back into an open heel shoe for that very shoeing. And it was funny when I put that on, and I just put it on for interest sake to see what people thought. You know, everybody was telling me what a great foot that was, and that's amazing that foot is a thoroughbred foot. But when you look at the angles, you've got 11 degrees of difference between the dorsal wall and heel angle, and you're saying that under heels are 5 degrees or more. And it just shows that until you get down at this level and you look at the heel and the dorsal wall angle at, you know, from the ground side, basically from the ground height, it's really hard to determine. So most people would say, yep, you can see a little bit of curvature in the coronary band, but most people would be rapt to have that foot on their books. There wouldn't be too many people that would be go, oh, that's got an issue. But this is when we should be starting to try and correct these heels. If we want to stay in open heel shoes, we need to start going, there's an 11-degree difference here. We need to start correcting that now and preventing it from getting worse. Not a comfort issue or a soundness issue before starting to correct it when it's 25 degrees and not 39. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and like you say, I think, you know, looking at it from this is actually really, really important. And
so this is a really good one. So this is a thoroughbred, 13 or 14 years old. People tell me that, you know, they talk about weak-footed horses and you know, it's not our fault. And it's not farriery. It's the horse. It's breeding. You couldn't get a more wrecked hoof than this one. So this came into me in open heel metal shoes. This is the right hind foot. I shot it once in duo-elliptical shoes, and it went to South Australia or the owner took it to South Australia, and somebody over there, thankfully, who I know, and they're a good farrier, saw that we had the duo-ellipticals on, didn't want to put them in that for some reason, went to the pads, and that's fine. What you see there, I think is 6.5 or 7 weeks in that first photo. That was actually quite a nice shoeing on day one. But you can see how wrecked that hoof capsule is. So, you know, 2 shoeings later, you can see that we've got starting to get some, you know, duo-elliptical shoe, we're starting to get some structural integrity in that heel. And the next shoeing, you can see the difference in heel angle. You couldn't even measure that on that first shoeing. It was that flat. And you can see that we've probably got, you know, maybe 30 degrees heel angle, 28 to 30 degrees heel angle probably in that last photo. So I suppose what this proves is that it doesn't matter how weak that capsule is. You know, if we give the foot some support, especially that caudal foot, and we shoe around proportions that we're talking about, we can correct those. And then you've got to come back to say, why do we want a foot to go to the position that one is in the very first photo? Why aren't we shoeing with this sort of support to prevent that occurring in the first place? You know, I think we have to have a real change in our critical thinking on our shoeing styles and shoeing and trimming protocols, because it just doesn't make sense to me that we allow the foot to totally fail and then we start using caudal support to try and build it back up.
Yeah,
I think we'd be much better off working out ways to prevent that failure from happening, you know, from the start. But a pretty good example, I thought, this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And And going back to looking at it from this view, and also looking at this foot here, if we can see that if that foot had been monitored and the deterioration had been spotted earlier, then perhaps it would never have got that bad. I think we need to start recognising deterioration as soon as possible. And we can only do that by monitoring and by being self-critical, I think.
And I think the owners have a part to play in this too. You know, it's not up to the farrier to request X-rays. Really, the owners need to be doing it. The owners can take photos of their horse's feet after every shoeing, put them on blocks when the farrier's there, get a bit of help to hold the horse, and they can do all of this work. We're not saying at all that the farrier should be down doing what I do, which gets, you know, down on my hands and knees taking photos of all of my horses every third or fourth shoeing. Owners can play their part and keep a file on their computer and share it with their farriers, and you know, it can be a real team effort to get this. But what's really great there, and I see it a lot online, is people go, oh, look at this great shoeing that I've done. And they're taking a photo from 5 feet in the air or 6 feet in the air, which exactly what you've proven there means very little.
Yeah, exactly.
When you get down to ground level and you take the photo, different story.
Yeah, and I think actually, I think farriers should be taking photos regularly of their.
Yeah, I do too.
And I think again, it's important that they take ground level photos, incorporating the metacarpal tarsal. And I do this in my work. I do this because with a true ground level photo, as you were saying before, you get a much more objective view of where you're actually at. And if you're photographing it at an angle or with obliquity or from above, like on the left, we can really disguise poor alignment and focus the attention onto the aesthetics, like a pretty outline. But basically, at a ground level, 90-degree lateral, there's not really any hiding. You know, and I think I found a huge jump in my work, in the quality of my work when I started doing this, because one, I could no longer ignore the poor alignment.
Yeah.
Two, because it made me accountable, and three, the general quality of the job and all of those other points was staring me in the face. Everything from the nail line to the fit, but also, you know, where are our feet actually at? You know, is there good dorsopalmar balance? Is there good alignment? And you need to be able to compare that photo with one from a few shoeing cycles time. So we need to be monitoring them and having a protocol for taking our photos to make sure that we're actually assessing these feet properly. Absolutely.
So we most people who look at our Facebook page would see that we always put ours on blocks with a backing, and it takes, you know, to do those photos takes 5 minutes, 5 minutes max. With a horse that's happy to stand on the blocks, there's a few that aren't quite that happy, but you know, it's not a huge amount of time, and if you keep them on file for the owner, you know, we're in a world of technology, so have your computer or your tablet there, you just download them. If you've got Apple stuff, you can just put it next to it and it downloads it wherever you want it. So it's really, we're in a great time in life to be able to use technology to make this really easy and keep good records and good account of what we're doing, for sure.
And even for people who don't have the technology, you know, this photo here took me 2 seconds to take, you know, gradual 90 degrees to the foot. And, you know, and I can see now that this horse has a poor hoof past an axis, and, you know, we've got improvements to make. And, you know, this is the point where I would probably say to the client, you know, I think we need to get some x-rays done.
So this is a bit of what we do with our hoof scan. You know, photos and x-rays, and we use the Metron software to mark them up. You know, so what you were seeing with yours before is fantastic. You can see the differences, but to be very accurate, we can mark these up with the software, and we can be really objective about the direction that we're heading and the direction that we need to go, and you know, the changes in the hoof capsule over periods of time. You know, I think this is to me is the future of where farriery is going to go. I think getting a hoof scan, or whatever people in the future call it, that's just my word for what we do. I think it's going to be like getting your horse's teeth done. You'll get a yearly one that'll be passed on to your farrier. Your farrier will be able to look at it and compare. And that's going to prevent feet going really bad, because you're going to catch it. We always talk about prevention is better than correction.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important part with horses, because there's a lot of horses out there in significant discomfort. And that affects everything from your enjoyment of having them to their health and well-being, lameness, you know, all of those sort of things. So I think this is definitely the future of where farriery will go.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And you know, even looking at it from that view, doesn't show us the full picture. So that just expresses the importance of the radiographs as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And, you know, with that sort of information, and I think this is where the industry has to again adapt to the future of the industry. We need to, you know, we've got farriers in my area who have no interest in looking at x-rays whatsoever. And I just think, you know, how can you not have or want that data? I'm just miffed at that. I think the more information that you have, if you know how to read it and you know how to use it, is absolutely vital. And as I said, looking at those photos and these x-rays gives you a good understanding of where you have to go. It's very objective, it's very accurate. It takes the guesswork out of it.
Yeah.
And you know, people say to me all the time, what do you x-ray them every time? And you go, no, we don't have to, because when you see what you've got there, we know what we're working towards. And I think that's really important. There's a hind foot that we see a lot of. For some reason, we get a lot of depth under the tip of P3 in these horses. This was a good show jumper that was, you know, having major dramas. And I think, you know, any time that you see a hoof capsule that looks unusual, I think you've got to start questioning why. And, you know, you can see that dorsal wall comes, you know, 2/3 of the way down, and there's a severe dumping of it. Which I think a lot of times, because of that angle that's getting, the toe looks like it's getting longer, and the farrier's just starting to blunt that back a little bit. And it just starts that process of wear in the toe. Then the horse starts stabbing its toe into the ground on landing. There's a whole range of issues. But negative, I was just saying today on my Facebook page, negative alignment of late. We're seeing 50 to 60% of the hoof scans we're doing, and we're doing about 10 a week. So that's half to more than half have negative hind angles. So the NPA in the hind feet. And we're seeing about 20 to 30% in the front feet. So it is a massive, massive issue having these negative angles, and as we've discussed already, how that changes posture and stance and load and performance and, you know, anxiety, behaviour, everything. It's really important.
Well, I mean, negative plantar angles, you know, in the hind feet are just beginning to be studied, really. And they've now, like Clements 2019 stated that negative plantar angles were the most common hind hoof conformation. And like you said, what percentage did you say they're coming in at?
Well, what we're seeing of late, 50 to 60% of all the horses we're hoof scanning. Yeah. So that's a massive amount.
Yeah. So, and then obviously negative plantar angles have then been linked to pathology all the way along the dorsal myofascial line. So that goes back to the discussion that I had with Martina.
Yeah. So what we've found is that alignment issues like this in the front feet tend to affect joints more than soft tissue, but soft tissue as well. But in the hinds, we generally get a lot of discomfort in the sacrolumbar, sacrolumbar area, the hamstrings, through the suspensories. They tend to be a lot more soft tissue areas in the hinds than the fronts, but just very uncomfortable, altering stance. It's really discomforting for the horse.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that referring of the pathology to higher structures comes down to that change in posture. And you know, the studies that have linked negative plantar angles to higher pathologies include Well, Dyson made a link between MPA and proximal suspensory desmitis. And then you've got Pezzanite, who linked it to hock pathology. You've got Clements, who linked it to stifle pathology. You've got Mansman, who linked it to gluteal tightness. He also talked about issues further into the trunk, so SI, kissing spines, etc. So, you know, this negative plantar angles, and again, coming back to the fact that this is created because of caudal failure, is linked to issues all the way up the hind leg and all the way to the trunk. So, you know, these are
absolutely. Even on that one, if you look at that heel angle, you can see the difference, significant difference. And so, and you know, we're one of the big universities over here talked about the degree of hind suspensory issues that they're having. And when you think, you know, they're saying that that's about the biggest pathology that they're seeing at the moment. And when you think about the amount of hind feet that are poorly aligned and NPA, and that's the drive of the horse, you know, that's coming under arguably the most load. So it's understandable.
Yeah, and going back to these distortions causing poor hoof pastanaxis, there's obviously a lot of discussions about whether realignment is good practice. Now, taking into consideration everything we've been discussing, that hoof pastanaxis is a product of this caudal failure and heel to toe ratio, and considering a high percentage of caudal hoof structures are distorted and collapsed to varying degrees, suggests to me that most horses would be more upright and therefore more aligned than they actually are. Therefore, there's a high percentage of horses that do require elevation of the heels, proportionate to the amount of caudal hoof distortion or collapse. Perhaps if farriery sought to proactively mitigate the unintended consequences of shoeing with the use of modern materials, to more closely emulate the barefoot, we would see less broken hoof pastanaxis. Now, I think in the absence of other issues that would perpetuate caudal hoof collapse, if these same horses went barefoot without obviously the other issues, they would likely create a straighter hoof pastanaxis with improved hoof morphology. So again, if that indicates that they want a more straight hoof pastanaxis than they've got. That suggests that a proportion of shod horses present with a lower hoof angle and a broken hoof pastanaxis than they would have if they didn't have this collapse.
Yeah, absolutely. And,
so
I think it's really important. Sorry, go.
So, I mean, you know, so where should the hoof pastanaxis be? I think some people would suggest that there's a healthy range for hoof pastanaxis and bone alignment. And I kind of was thinking about this, thought if you could somehow calculate the cumulative effect of the distortions and the collapses that are present into an amount of reduced heel height and angle, then there would probably be your answer. So I would suggest it would be close, or at least closer to aligned than it already is. So until we can calculate that, I think we should aim for as close as ideal as possible when we're talking about realigning. So we can't say that a broken back hoof pastanaxis is normal and acceptable if there's obvious caudal hoof distortions due to shoeing or otherwise. So, you know, I think if you show me a foot that has no caudal distortion and therefore a good toe to heel ratio, I think for the most part we'll see a digit that's got good hoof pastanaxis within an acceptable range. So I found that good alignment, you know, not perfect but acceptable, is almost always achievable with the right intervention. And also, I don't mean artificially, I mean you do get genuinely improved hoof proportions. So you know, if we look at this foot before and after intervention and looking purely at the foot, ignoring the elevation that I provided, the before and after I've been superimposed over each other, and the estimated proportions, what I think that the foot would be with no distortions taken from the toe angle of the after job, creating a straight coronet to heel, 1/3 of the height and the same angle as the toe. So in the middle, I've calculated what that foot would be without the distortions. And I think we can create very close to this, minus a degree or two at the heel. So before we say that a broken alignment is normal, we shouldn't elevate, because you know that is going around a lot. We need to make sure that we're talking about a hoof that doesn't have any caudal distortion. You know, because there's no way that, that foot on the top left is where that hoof should be, and therefore where the hoof pastanaxis should be, right?
Yeah. So I think what you're talking about is there's a little bit of a whisper or a movement going around that's questioning whether alignment is ideal, or whether it's a bit, you know, if it's not ideal. But I think, you know, when you talk about, which is what you've been saying, is when you talk about alignment, if you have caudal heel failure, so you have underrun heels and lower caudal or heels of the foot, we can't say that that's normal, because we know that it's not. So we can't judge that foot on that's common, but it's not necessarily correct. Yeah, exactly. And I've been reverse engineering a lot of the feet that I've been photographing, and all I've been doing is looking at heel lengths and changing that heel length to be about what the dorsal length is. And it's amazing how much or how closely that would create alignment. So yeah, I think that you can't have one without the other. If you've got caudal heel failure, you can't make a judgment on whether that foot is correctly aligned or whether it's not.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I've done here. I've reverse engineered the failures that we've got and superimposed them onto each other. So you can see the difference in where the foot would be. Obviously, in the middle is, you know, my reverse engineered foot of what that foot would be if we removed all the distortions. You know, absolutely. If we had that foot, we would probably have a close to ideal hoof pastanaxis.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that you're mentioning about some people don't believe in elevation, or they're a bit concerned, but we've got a couple of vets in our area who are quite against it. And what they're saying is that it overloads. So when you elevate the foot, it places load on other ligaments and tendons, which is absolutely correct. But when you've got a broken back alignment, we've got so much extra load on things like the deep flexor that you're actually creating more, equalization of load, as opposed to having excessive load on one and underloading the other. So, you know, without getting too technical on how all the ligaments and tendons work, we're creating more equilibrium by creating better alignment, as opposed to, I just think that is, I'm just gobsmacked that people are actually going around talking about that when we've had such good results for so often and so long. Obviously, if you've got a dramatic change, we're not saying go out and go show jumping like that other horse did, but, you know, give the horse a couple of weeks to get used to it and bring it back into work over time. Make sure you get body work and be smart about it. But that horse will appreciate that alignment from day one in 99% of times.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, and this is what I see when you start providing that caudal support and you start creating those proportions, you do see everything start to. Now these images I took of a case of mine, I took at a slightly different angle because I wanted to show the changes in the posture as well. But you can see the difference in the hoof proportion. So at the end, we end up back in a flat shoe with a good hoof pastanaxis. Now this was achieved with a graduated duroellipse, which you mentioned before as well. And this is another one using the same method, into and then back out of elevation. I think that's important to that with the improvement of the caudal structures, you get better proportions and better alignment, and then you can start come back out of these interventions, can't we?
Yeah, personally, we do, but I still question that occasionally. I think that if you've got a hoof capsule that fails behind, I think when you go back into these flat shoes, you sort of start to go backwards again a lot of the times. But I do it as well, and I sometimes question why I do it as well. But unfortunately, at the moment, the norm and what most people are wanting is open heel shoes, and I think that'll change, in the next 10 years for sure.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I'm getting more. Even with this horse here, we ended up in flat shoes, but we still had frog support padding.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that we didn't go back down the negative cycle. But foot on the left, there's no way you could say, considering the foot that we ended up with, that foot didn't need elevation.
No, and there's no way to get from the one on the left to the one on the right without frog support, and most likely being a hind foot elevation as well, because that postural adaptation of me having been more forward continually crushes those heels. And and I think that's a really important, even more so in the hind feet. I feel that's where I've achieved more success, by creating alignment and creating better posture and load through the foot.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, coming back to the fact that if that one on the left-hand side had support from day one, then perhaps we never would have got to that state in the first place.
And that's the important one.
Yeah, exactly.
Why are we continually correcting when we can prevent? Because that's much better.
Yeah, exactly.
So here's a really good example of HPA on the left and ideal alignment on the right, both in barefoot horses. Although the horse on the left, obviously I shoe that one, but it's barefoot at that time.
Yeah, so I think it's important to have this image in there, because it shows us, what it should really look like. And I think we often forget what they should actually look like. Which means that this caudal failure kind of gets overlooked because we're forgetting what the ideal actually looks like.
Yeah, and I think surface is going to play a big part in it. If you have a really, really soft ground through winter, we're not saying throw all of your open heel shoes away, because they're going to sink enough into the ground that you're going to create enough contact and support of that. But once the ground gets a little bit firmer, I think that's where we struggle the most. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think, for me, to conclude, something that I think is very important for us to take away from this is that, the skill of the farrier does play a role in keeping feet in good condition. Also, the individual horse's micro-conformation plays a role. But in reality, I think keeping these feet in good condition could well be in spite of the traditional methods that are being used, which I think we've seen predisposes them to collapse. And the fact that you're lucky enough to be shoeing a horse or breed of horse with the feet that can take it, that just means you're lucky, because most of them are ending up with this caudal collapse. I think we need to question the prevalence of these poor caudal hoof distortions, as you're saying. It's 90% for the ones you're seeing. That's just unacceptable, isn't it? We need to question.
That's documented 90%. That's not guesswork. That's been put out, that's been put through the software and measured angles and alignments. That's not, I guess, that's X, Y, Z.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you take the percentages of the other studies, 75% and a 50%, still, that's still unacceptable, I think. And we need to, instead of accepting these distortions as a norm, which is what they actually are now, we have to understand, we have the understanding and the methods to help prevent them and treat them. But really, I think the question is perhaps we should create a new norm in our practices and look after the caudal structures that are vital in hoof health from day one, from the first outset. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
That we're coming to.
Absolutely, and there's so many new technologies now. As you've got up here, you've got your former hoof at the top. You've got we're now 3D printing pads, which is pretty amazing. Which is that one on the top right and the one in the top middle. I know ourselves, we're trying to produce a shoe that's going to give us a lot more function like a barefoot foot. That's what we're currently doing at the moment, and we'll keep everybody abreast of what's going on. But you know, I think when you've got even 75% of failure in an industry, I think you've got to accept that things are not where they need to be. And there's no doubt at all that management plays a part to some degree, quality of farrier plays a part, cycles play a part. But what I see is no matter the quality, no matter the cycle that you do, no matter the quality of the farrier, still we get that same issue from one horse to the next. The caudal foot collapses to some degree. It might take longer if you're better and you have shorter shoeing cycles and all those sort of things, but we still get, that's the area that we haven't worked out in farrier in 600 years.
Yeah, and I completely agree, and that's why, you know, these interventions here that you can see is kind of become the mainstay of my work now, and re-engaging those caudal structures and giving them support. I think you know your shoe in the middle, bottom middle there as well is these are the kind of things that I think we need to start looking into for the whole industry. From day one to, again, it comes back to the barefoot, and trying to replicate that barefoot function. And
I don't think there's a farrier out there who when they accept that the foot has collapsed, and as we said, unfortunately, that's generally when there's an issue with comfort or performance, or the horse is not going well, it's becoming lame, whatever the issue is, we all reach for the same thing. We all support that caudal foot to try and correct it. So I think we're all pretty understanding of the benefits of caudal support, but to me, I just doesn't make sense to me to know that will prevent or correct that issue, but why we continue to go down the path of shoeing horses with open heel shoes until we get to a certain point, and then we change it to try and correct it. Prevention is such a better option than correction or cure.
Exactly, and I think that's probably the best statement that we can conclude this on. Really, end this is, prevention is better than cure, and
absolutely, we
have the understanding and we have the materials to be able to do that. So prevention is better than cure. So thank you very much, Wayne, for your time. I think we're very much in agreement there, and I think it's been a pleasure. Enjoyed it.